Hi, I'm Colm O'Sullivan, and this is the Policy Options Podcast. The last year has been a reckoning for so many aspects of our society. The pandemic exposed serious flaws in our healthcare and long-term care sector, and racist attacks against people of color have shone light on the dark side of Canada. But one story specifically stood out to me because it's so atrocious that you can't bear to ignore it.
Another sad discovery. The remains of 182 bodies.
The remains of 215 children.
The 751 unmarked graves found at the site of a former residential school for Indigenous children.
The ongoing discoveries of unmarked graves at residential schools across the country has changed the way we frame Indigenous issues. And while many Indigenous people knew about these graves and tried to shine light on them for decades, they continued to be hidden from the public by various institutions and governments. But we have to be very clear. Canada has committed a genocide in the truest form of the word. From the late 19th century up until 1996, Canada abducted over 150,000 Indigenous children from their families in order to, as John A. Macdonald put it, remove the Indian from the child. But beyond this, Canadians are learning that we have an individual responsibility to advance reconciliation ourselves. In fact, a new survey conducted by the Environix Institute for Survey Research, along with the IRPP and a number of other leading public policy organizations called the Confederation of Tomorrows, showed that the percentage of Canadians who believe individuals have a role in advancing reconciliation has increased from 55% in 2020 to 70% in 2021. Now, these statistics were taken before the news of any unmarked graves came to light. So I wanted to explore what the average Canadian citizen can do to advance reconciliation on their own and push for fundamental change. Today, I'm speaking with Tara Williamson and Robert Houle. They're researchers at the Yellowhead Institute, a First Nations-led research center that aims to foster education and dialogue on First Nations governance. Tara Williamson and Robert Houle, thank you both so much for joining me today on the podcast.
No problem. Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
Now, we're going to be talking a lot about reconciliation and how the average Canadian citizen can push for this. But I wonder if there is a set definition or if it's more individualistic to communities and people.
We have to understand that the way that reconciliation has been defined in Canada and through the TRC, because of course the TRC was involved with the churches and the commission and everything, they took a very kind of, I don't want to say religiously influenced definition of reconciliation, but that's kind of what the overarching theme came out in the end, is that Canada recognizes that there are harms and that they want to make amends and try to reconcile to the best of their ability. In our old traditional Indigenous ways, reconciliation had a much different meaning. It meant a fulsome acceptance of the wrongs and doing your best to try to rectify those wrongs in any way possible. But that is much different than the definition that we have seen in Canada, and it's much more of a legal definition here as well. And the problem with reconciliation is it has to come after a harm has been done, and that's not necessarily the best way to build relationships or to respect one another.
Yeah, and I think that we're entering also into sort of, maybe it's premature to say, but sort of a second generation definition of reconciliation. Like, I think it's been long enough now that first generation, like Robert's saying, being really defined by the state and defined by state involvement with churches in that process. I think one of the things that's shifting that we're sort of in the middle of is, that idea that Indigenous people are going to reconcile themselves to what's already there in the state that's there. Now, in my mind, what I think I'm seeing is the second generation notion of reconciliation that's really more about building the infrastructure so that it's not just one-sided. And I think we're especially seeing that more and more, in particular through the counting of graves that's happening right now. That's, it's becoming more and more difficult to ignore the truth part of truth and reconciliation. And that it's making demands on a system to have processes and infrastructure in place to actually do something meaningful. So that might be a bit premature and might even be optimistic, which is not usually my style, but I do feel like something in the last little bit has shifted compared to those first few years of talking about reconciliation after the TRC report came out.
I actually want to touch on something you mentioned about the generational aspects of reconciliation, because different generations of Indigenous people have had different experiences with governments. And I wonder, in your view, if the definition of reconciliation is changing throughout generations.
I think the expectations of a young generation now about what reconciliation is on one hand not different. You know, the notion of land back, the notion of colonization in Canada itself being bunk and unjust at its core. I don't think that that's necessarily different. I think people have been fighting for more than recognition, more than reconciliation for a long time. But again, I do think that there is a different expectation. I think that younger generations, in my perspective, have an expectation that things absolutely will change and need to change. But again, it's not to say they're not, it's not the first generation to recognize the unjustness of the scenario or be working diligently towards something better.
Yeah, I think there's been a real conversation started and a more in-depth analysis and research on younger Canadians who now have things like the internet and other tools at their disposal to really challenge some of these misnomers and miseducation by the state that other generations just didn't have. When you were older, growing up and going to school, and you didn't have the opportunity to challenge what you were being taught in school about Indigenous people and about First Nations and about taxes and all these other myths that we know have been perpetuated by the systems and by the state and by the governments. But now I think we're seeing young people challenge these things and take a second look and do their own research and read a little bit more about it, and then kind of see the real injustice and the real unfortunate one-sided relationship that's been developed here, and then probably maybe putting themselves in our position a little bit more and thinking, yeah, like these Indigenous people have been royally ripped off since day one, and that's not right. And if that was me in that position, I would be upset too. And I think that in a sense has taken on, like Tara said, a progression here where the initial conversation on reconciliation was monetary compensation for abuses and things like that. But now it's taking on another conversation, another advancement to, yeah, maybe we should start sharing more of the land and giving the land back, because that's what we essentially agreed to when settlement started.
Just to piggyback on that, from teaching that, and in fact, it's mostly non-Indigenous students that I hear it from, is that's the sentiment, is why didn't we learn this? Like and it's not, again, it's coming largely from non-Indigenous students saying, why haven't I learned this yet? So yeah, the frustration is extending beyond just Indigenous people in school. It's extending into the broader Canadian society, I think.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing a lot more of that, and I do want to talk more about the education side of it, but I want to focus in on how these sentiments are progressing, because they are changing on a yearly basis, and this can be seen in the 2021 Confederation of Tomorrows survey, where 70% of respondents said individuals have a role to play in advancing reconciliation, and that's up from the same survey in 2020, which just last year showed that 55% said the same thing. Now, that's quite the change, so what can people do, and how can they push governments to better advance reconciliation?
Well, I think that like relationship building, one of the things I teach often is about debunking myths and stereotypes. One of the things that I often respond to and say is that, we maintain myths and stereotypes until we have a relationship. So, you might hear somebody say, all Indigenous people are XYZ, but not you. Or I heard this, but not, no, it doesn't apply to you. And I point out that the reason we do that is because it's very difficult to stereotype people that we know, people who we have relationships with, who we know on a personal level. And so I think that, as small as it may seem, basic relationship building, I'm still the first Indigenous people some students meet. And that's sort of bizarre to me, but I appreciate, that's not necessarily of their doing. It's just the way the society is set up. And I think also that the listening and responding. So I've heard lots of people say, listen to us, listen to what we're saying, believe it. And that's very important. But now we're at the point where it's like, and do something, be responsive to it somehow. Because we've been talking about it for a while. Like Rob has pointed out, there's many ways to get information, educate yourself, going online, checking those things out. And so I think building meaningful relationships, which I think compels people to act, right? When people you care about are being harmed or being oppressed, we're compelled to act when we have that kind of relationship with them.
I think there's been a real effort to rehumanize Indigenous people, because we've been relegated to mascots, to figments of people's imagination. There's Daniel Francis uses the term the imaginary Indian, and that person is very much alive in older Canadians and in their mentalities of Indigenous people that were not real people, that we exist in some other sphere where another sort of commodity that can be traded, bought and sold like anything else, because we've been controlled by the government for so long. And we have to remember that it was only in the 1960s that we were given the chance to vote to become peoples. So it's not that long ago that we were very much one of those kind of things that the government just decided what they wanted to do with. And through this rehumanizing, people have become more connected to what's really going on in Indigenous communities, to the subhuman conditions that some of our people are forced to live in. And it's not by our own regard, it's because of where we were placed and how we've been dealt with. So I think there's a real effort by younger people to connect with Indigenous people and see us as human beings, as opposed to the way past generations have. And then that reflects in people reading more and learning more. And in the West, where I come from, Treaty Number 8 territory, if you read the treaties, the first line is the Queen and all her subjects agree to enter into a treaty with the nations of Treaty Number 8. Well, that very much is the Queen and all of her subjects, as the Queen and all Canadians. So there is an individual responsibility to uphold some of these agreements. And then if you go into the non-treaty territories, Aboriginal title still exists. So if you're not the landowner and you have no rights to the land, then you better build a relationship with the people that do. And I think people are understanding and learning that a little bit more. And it's unfortunate that it takes hundreds of thousands of dollars in court cases to do that. But I think when people see the facts plain on their face, it's hard to dispute some of this stuff.
So what I'm hearing basically is meet Indigenous people, get to know them and their stories and histories. And, I'm seeing a lot more Indigenous influencers on social media who are sharing Indigenous culture and history. And I think that's just a small way that the conversation is being reshaped. And that's really interesting to me. But turning back to the Confederation of Tomorrows survey, we saw that only 15% of Indigenous respondents said that the federal government best represents their interest, and 27% said that their Indigenous government best represents them. So what does the federal government need to do to improve these numbers, and how can local Indigenous governments work to better represent the interests of Indigenous people?
So first of all, I want to point out that both of those numbers are low, are really low, and I think we should strive better. So just, even if Indigenous people are feeling like just fundamentally at a local level, because the chief and counselors, but whatever, your local government, because those numbers are slightly higher, but those are still pretty low numbers in terms of Indigenous people feeling like their interests are being represented. So I think one of the first issues is just the structure. The structure is set up to be top down. When we look at the Indian Act and Chief and Council, we look at to whom are those leadership accountable. Well, the money is flowing from government departments down to leadership at band council level and then to community. And really, we know there's so many different models of Indigenous governance. Of course, there isn't one pan-Indigenous model, but we know that decentralized, more responsive, bottom-up styles of leadership were much more common than sort of a representative democracy. The biggest thing is changing of the structure, making sure that Indigenous people have the support and resources to be able to rebuild governance structures that suit them. It has to be customized for each community, each nation, each governance sort of unit, and making sure that that's given power and that people give that power and that it's recognized by the federal government. Although I don't like to talk about recognition by the federal government.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Tara was saying, that it shows a real flaw in this democratic system that has been, first of all, brought here and then transposed to Indigenous communities, erasing our traditional governance models, which in some communities was very consensus based and very deliberate in that fashion, because it shows a respect for one another, even though you may have difference of opinions or difference of viewpoints. That effort of getting to consensus, where there are concessions on each side, is part of just foundational and fundamental relationship building and making sound decisions. And when that is taken away for the authority of the majority, then people just become disinterested and disenfranchised, and that's what you're seeing in some of these numbers, I think. And to my earlier point, you got to remember that it was only 60 years ago that Indigenous people were allowed to vote. So that shows me a lot of trust and relationship building needed with older generations and newer generations, because my grandparents wouldn't have had the chance to vote until they were probably in their 20s or their 30s. And that is, in this country, unacceptable for people to not have those opportunities, and then to try to push to have them involved. It takes a lot of additional effort. And just to add to what Tara's saying, yeah, a lot of those policies and a lot of the rules that we govern ourselves by today weren't ours, and they were actually pressed upon our communities.
Now, Robert, earlier you had mentioned this misinformation by the state, and I want to quote an article by Riley Yesno where she writes, "Before reconciliation is possible, Canadians must admit the truth." And she goes on to say, there's a reason why truth comes before reconciliation. And I want to hear your thoughts on that and what truths Canadians have to learn as we work towards reconciliation.
I don't want it to come off as sadistic, but it feels like the horror. And I think, again, that's the horror of genocide, the horror of colonization. And I don't wish that people experience it in a firsthand kind of way. That's the sadism I'm not avoiding. That's not what I mean. But I think that's partially what's happening again with graves being discovered, in that until you really understand the magnitude of what happened to a huge various groups of people across the world. Also, I think there's also this opportunity to connect to a global understanding of history and how the world's been created, and those structures of capitalism and imperialism, like making all those connections. But you can't really humanize somebody until I think you understand where they've been and what they've gone through. And so, unfortunately, I think it's very much about recognizing the atrocities that have happened so that you're able to better understand where people are coming from. And so also that reconciliation has meaning, because otherwise it's sort of hollow, right? And asking people to perform reconciliation in an empty vessel of, well, for what? For what reason? I think causes resentment. I think it feels like busy work when you're, it's just another tick the box, tokenized, whatever. And so I think truth is the piece that gives content to the meaning of reconciliation and makes it meaningful. And unfortunately, it's painful. It's painful to even just witness. It sucks, but we made it through.
As we continue down this journey of truth, it comes to a place where we have to agree upon and come to an understanding on what the facts and the truth are about Canada. And scholar Leroy Littlebear put it very plainly when he said that Canada is a pretend nation, that the foundations upon which Canada has placed itself in the world forum are based upon myths and misnomers, and everyone and all Canadians have no further look than the recent Governor General appointment, and listen to the language, listen to the conversations, listen to the process that was carried out. The Governor General is the Commander in Chief of Canada. It's not the Prime Minister, it's the Governor General. And why? Because she's a representative of the Queen. And why do we still have that relationship? Well, because to be a nation, you have to have, as far as I understand it, three things. You have to have a language, you have to have a peoples, and you have to have land. And in Canada, the Canadian government has no land. The land still belongs to Indigenous people through ceded and unceded territories. And that is a foundational truth about this country. And that the only way for Canada to gain that land is to either dispossess, displace, or destroy Indigenous communities. And I think that's what Tara was touching on, is that there's been a lot of effort to destroy Indigenous communities and displace them, but there hasn't been any effort to want to reconcile and reconnect and build relationships with them since day one. And I think that's kind of one of the most foundational truths we have to come to. And once we come to that, then we can start to move together forward together to build a Canada that was originally envisioned when people set foot on this land all those years ago.
Tara, something you mentioned was this understanding of the horror of colonization. And this is something that's really come to a head with the ongoing discoveries of unmarked graves at so many residential schools across the country. And for a lot of people, this was a surprise, but for others, it was an affirmation of what they already knew. And in the Confederation of Tomorrows report, 43% of people said that the government hasn't gone far enough in advancing reconciliation, but this survey was done before the discoveries were made. And on the other hand, you have 20% of respondents saying the government has gone too far in advancing reconciliation. Now, these numbers might have changed since the discoveries, and for the people who have changed their mind, what steps can they take to unlearn some of the misinformation that they've been taught that may have led them to this belief?
I mean, yeah, I've thought the same thing. I'm like, I wonder what the numbers are after, right? Because I do think that, again, this is speaking directly to your question before about truth and reconciliation, which is if you don't know the truth, then yes, you're going to feel like, what's the point of reconciliation? The government's doing too much. You're going to be able to sort of hold up those stereotypes and myths around, handouts and all those sorts of things, and not see it as being part of a larger narrative of making things right, right? So I do think that I am curious as to if the numbers have changed and what they look, like in a few months or next year. So, but otherwise, I mean, it's the easiest time in history, like Rob was pointing out earlier it's the easiest time in history to find things out. And it's also, I will give some kudos to mainstream media where, it's not difficult for me to turn on the news and hear about what's going on. Like, I think the actual just amount of content, even on mainstream stuff, has increased a lot. But otherwise, like there's not a ton of excuses anymore for not educating yourself. And so I think that's, the reconciliation notion without truth, to me, is what leads the way of 20% saying we're doing too much. And then there's also just a certain portion of that number that, like, there's just racism. There's just straight up, like, there'll always be a portion of the population who thinks too much is being done for any, like, name a group kind of deal. So there's a certain amount of that it's just unfortunately kind of the society we live in.
Yeah, I think once you pay attention to the coverage of Indigenous issues, once you pay attention to some of the conditions that our communities are in, it becomes kind of unfathomable that those situations exist, that people in their 20s today can grow up with never having fresh water or running water in their dwelling. Like, for things like that to happen and to be the reality that Indigenous people are living, I think it's shocking for a lot of younger Canadians to know that people their age can't have a shower every day and can't do some of the things that they take for granted. And that just builds to more understanding, more relationship building, and more support for Indigenous issues. And I think it's also maybe people are getting wise to what this system really is, right? That the system and the way that the settlements are set up and things like that it's just part of perpetuating capitalism and all these other things. Because people may gripe about where Indigenous settlements monies are going, but I think there's been a real effort by Indigenous people and Indigenous leaders to say all that money is going right back into non-Indigenous communities anyways. So what is the real issue? What is the real problem with all of this? And it goes back to what Tara was saying, that at the root of it, it's probably just racism.
Now, you say that to fully understand what's going on, we have to learn the truth. And Canada's education system hasn't done the best job of that. I mean, when I was young, I remember they were showing us videos with really outdated information that plays into these stereotypes and misinformation. And I did see it get marginally better as I went through the education system. And I mean, social media and the internet gave Indigenous people an opportunity to challenge some of this education. So if the education system isn't pulling its weight and challenging these myths and misinformation, what can parents and teachers do to give their children a more truthful education?
Well, I think it's important that they recognize that there are Indigenous communities across this country. There are some that are very close, that are right next door, that non-Indigenous people have probably traveled through or driven through or stopped to get gas in, but never really thought to think maybe I'm on the reserve or not. And I think that's where, like Tara was saying earlier, some of the younger people and some of the non-Indigenous people we meet that's the first Indigenous person that they've ever spoken to, because there's been this misinformation, this education campaign to teach people that the reserves are these lawless places, that no man's land, and that non-Indigenous people shouldn't go there. I still get questions whenever talking about a community celebration or a powwow or a round dance or things like that. You get non-Indigenous people saying, well, can I attend? I'm not from there. Can I go? And the clearest thing that any Canadian should understand is that through the history of this relationship is that Indigenous people have always been welcoming of other people into our communities and into our lands, maybe to a detriment if we look back on it, but definitely we've always been some of the most welcoming people. So it's about just putting aside that fear and that misinformation and experiencing for yourself our communities and our celebrations and our culture. And then when you do that, you'll probably start to challenge some of these stereotypes that you've learned over the years.
And I mean, that can take the form of just inviting Indigenous speakers or taking a field trip to reserves.
Yeah, and remembering that if and when you do that, that Indigenous people get compensated the same way. like we do accept money for our time when we're educating people. You know, again, part of relationship. How would you approach somebody to share something in a professional context? And I think the other thing is sort of being ready to understand that culture isn't depoliticized. You know, learning there will be that will be part of it. So I think you're looking for specialized knowledge. And so making sure people are being acknowledged, however it is that you do it in your institution, and then also sort of being prepared for that truth, which means things are political. Yes, we would love to share some Bannock with you, but we're not going to do it without telling you why we learned how to make Bannock because you took all our food. That's pretty rash way of saying it, but you know what I mean? I mean, I think it's asking educators, it's setting a high bar for people. I think people reach the bar that you set for them and saying, you wanted to be an educator because you wanted to teach. Here's a challenge for you, is how do you teach this and educate yourself so that it's not stripped of some of the most important meaning.
Yeah, and I mean, reaching out and forging those relationships is so important, especially right now, because another thing we've learned in this Confederation of Tomorrows survey is that 46% of Canadian respondents are somewhat more likely to describe relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people as negative. So in your view, what's driving this and what needs to be done to bridge this divide?
Because the relationship is pretty negative. I mean, that would be my guess, is that people feel that way because it's the way it is. But I think it's coming from, again, like we've talked about, this history that we've all inherited of stereotypes, of racism, of violence. Relations are pretty negative, and I think it's fueled. You know, as much as I said earlier, yes, I'm impressed. Mainstream media is, you know, incorporating more stuff. Still, it's fueled by stereotypes in media. It's fueled by racism in the structures. We've seen in the healthcare system, in particular in COVID, the kinds of racism that happens. We see in politics, of course, who's included, who's excluded. So I think that, again, that relationship building between people and communities, the truth aspect, the politicization, understanding the politics behind things, and committing to breaking down some of those institutional barriers that contribute to us having negative relationships with each other.
Yeah, I think it starts with the recognition that, like Tara said, the relationships are very negative. But why? Why can't we get along? Well, it's because one side has everything and the other side has nothing. And how can we start to make the relationship equitable? How can we start to share more? How can we ensure that everyone is getting their fair share and everyone's upholding their obligations? How can we make sure that the listeners that are Canadians, how can we ensure that people's emotions, people's experiences are being respected, and we're seeing a slow transgression and progress forward on some of that understanding. But we also recognize that there's probably a long ways to go, and that'll take some concessions on everybody's part, but mostly on the non-Indigenous Canadians side. And are we ready to do that? And if they're not, then conversation on why not. But I think it's been 150 plus years now that people have fully benefited from having a head start. So maybe it's time that we make the race a little bit more fair, and maybe it's time that we start to treat each other the way that is originally intended when treaty and other things were entered into.
There's this real Canadian pride in the notion of equality and equity from a Canadian perspective. And I think a really big thing is equality, but equality is substantive equality, not as formal equality. And I think that there's a way to tap into the Canadian mentality of actually, these are the things we're proud of. There is an identity. There's a Canadian identity, I think, that can be tapped into that upholds these values, that says, yes, you want there to be peace, but what does peace mean? Why don't we look to different Indigenous notions of what peace is? It's more than the absence of violence. Why don't we talk about equality? How do we get to equality if people are starting off unequally? There's opportunities in there to sort of tap into a Canadian identity and say, this is actually isn't that far away from what makes people feel pride.
Now, I fully agree with you there, but I think there is this double-edged sword where people look to that as kind of an excuse to not act on Indigenous issues, and they use it as kind of a crutch to say, well, look how great we are compared to, the States.
Yeah, and like not being as bad as America isn't a great measuring stick, Like I feel like you can do again, set a bar. Let's set the bar higher than that.
Now, Robert, I'd like to touch on something you just said about respecting our obligations, because there's been a lot of tension, especially before the pandemic, about Indigenous rights. And I'm thinking specifically about the Wet'suwet'en blockades and the Mi'kmaq fisheries conflict in Nova Scotia. And I wonder, when issues like this arise, how can we look past the noise and have a more nuanced conversation of the actual issues?
Well, I think it starts with just looking at the core of the issue, the foundations of the issue, and understanding why things aren't working out, or why there's problems, or why there's conflict. And for the most part, in both of those circumstances, it's because of either government action or government inaction. And in the case of the fisheries, they were simply trying to exert the rights that they had agreed to, and they were just trying to do the bare minimum that they were allowed to do. And of course, the government and other things refused to step in, refused to quell some of the uprising from other fishers and commercial fishers who have had wholesale exploitation on waters and other things like that. And that raises a lot of ire, and that can make things worse. It also goes back to the fundamental understanding and the reality and the truth that Indigenous people have certain rights in this country because we were here since time immemorial, and the land is Indigenous. It's always been Indigenous. It's always going to be Indigenous. And because of that, there are certain rights retained within that.
Sticking on the idea of these natural resources, another major finding in the report is that a majority of Canadians are supportive of the principle that the development of natural resources on Indigenous land should not proceed unless the Indigenous community that lives there agrees. Now, there's no doubt that this has been a major concern about energy pipelines and hydroelectric projects. So how do you see the support for the duty to consult changing and adapting?
Indigenous people have protested in the sense of saying, no, we're not, we use land. We might not think about it as resources. We might not think about it as having huge surplus and making huge profit and destroying the land base. But absolutely, we've always fished. We've always hunted. We've always done all of those things. And the Canadian government, via the courts, putting restrictions on what it looks like for Indigenous people to be able to use our land in the ways that we see fit. And that the duty to consult rests with the Canadian government. But what we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years is corporations suing the Canadian government for not having discharged their duty properly. And so in this sort of weird twist of events, private interests have suddenly become better at and more aware. I mean, let's be clear, a lot of it's self-interest, right? But out of that comes this sort of weird lobby group of corporate private interests and Indigenous groups saying, yes, you do need to consult. And yes, this is an important part of it in order to do any sort of development. And so there's some sort of shift happening in duty to consult. Plus, duty to consult has been very narrow, and it's been pulled back even from that. Circumstances meant consent. It almost never means consent. So let's be clear about that. The duty is also, it's quite a low threshold to have to meet in order to consult. So the fact that the government is not even doing that well at a low threshold is telling. Knowing that a majority of Canadians or respondents absolutely think consultation should happen. Knowing that corporations are now just going directly to Indigenous people saying, how do we do this in a way that does a better job than the government? I think it's an interesting turning point of sorts.
And I mean, let's not give corporations too much credit here, right? It was really
not.
Indigenous people who fought hard for this.
And I think it's also come to a place where they've realized that in the bottom line, it makes more sense to want to engage meaningfully and to pay costs, pay consultation fees, pay those things up front rather than backloading everything through court challenges and legal cases and everything else.
Now, the point of this episode really is the individual's guide to reconciliation. And I think a lot of the corporate and political advancement that we've seen in this area is really coming from the electorate, right? I mean, governments have changed their stances and are taking these things seriously because voters demanded it and enforced these changes.
Yeah, I mean, I would, follow up on what you'd said before, also like on the electorate, but also on Indigenous people fighting tirelessly to make it be on the agenda, right? And for people to listen. But yes, but again, in the spirit of relationship, it absolutely requires that, all parties have some sort of buy-in or at least listening at the very least.
And I mean, that really comes back to Indigenous people through social media or whatever means being able to reclaim their stories and battle the misinformation that generations of Canadians have been told. Now, we've said a few times in this conversation to just Google the information, but if people do want reliable information, do you have any suggestions on where they can start?
Well, the Yellowhead Institute has very many publications available for reading. I mean, I think the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has a lot of good not just archival stuff, but new sort of contemporary readings. I think the First Nations Caring Society, I believe it's called, it's beyond just child welfare, but I do think that children and families and child welfare is an incredibly crucial thing for Canadians to know and learn about. And then there's also a group called Settlers Take Action that I don't know if they just have a Facebook page or a website, but they do a lot of cool infographics and memes. So in terms of like soundbite, like, oh, something just happened, I want to know about it. Like it's sort of a good place to go and get, and it's aimed at settlers. So it's sort of filtered for explained. So those would be some of the places I would recommend.
Yeah, I think spend a day going into the NFB archives on Indigenous stories and films, and there's a number of there. Alana Boswin has a number of pieces on there. Every Canadian should watch Dancing Around the Table for the constitutional conferences and put themselves in the shoes of Bob Wilson and other people that were around the table trying to have a humanistic, respectful conversation with the government and seeing their approaches towards our ways and our people and our leaders. There are a number of resources. There are some foundational pieces like that film that people need to watch to understand how the relationship has gotten to where it is today and what the obligations of everyone are, and just to put yourselves in Indigenous people's shoes and think, how would you respond in some of these interactions?
Well, Tara Williamson and Robert Houle, thank you both so much for speaking with me today. This was a really thought-provoking conversation.
No, thank you. Hi, thanks for having us.
Awesome, you glad. Thank you.
I want to say thanks again to Tara and Robert for joining me this week. If you're interested in some of the work that the Yellowhead Institute is doing, I encourage you to check them out at yellowheadinstitute.org. And if you would like to read the full Confederation of Tomorrows report, you can do so on our website at IRPP.org. And I really hope you get a chance to check that out because there is a lot of really interesting statistics that we didn't get to cover today. If you would like to get in contact with us, you can do so on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter under the handle IRPP. And if you would like to get in contact with me, you can do so on Twitter at Colm F. O'Sullivan. That's COLM F. O'Sullivan. Thanks for listening.